do I ever get to tell pirate stories. I mean, like, ever, let alone on a podcast about weather. But today's tale is real life. No legend, no exaggeration. Strictly earth science, people. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in its second year from the Weather Network in Canada. On Saturday, June 7th, back in 1692, an earthquake struck Port Royal. I can tell you exactly when and how I know this because it too fits the big picture of what happened here this day in weather history. Let's open up with when it happened and how I know that. In 1959, 267 years after the events of 1692, there was an underwater archaeological investigation looking to uncover new truths about this earthquake and the life and times of when it occurred. It was in this expedition that a pocket watch was found on the ocean's surface that had stopped at 11:43 in the morning. A Pompeii moment? Perhaps. But let's dig into just what the affected location was about. Who lived there? What was life like there? I've covered this kind of investigative analysis before on episodes involving Pompeii, Martinique, Vanport, and many others, so I really do love to get the chance to get that whole picture together so you all have true relevance. And this one is crazy. Port Royal was one of the most popular and wealthiest ports in all of the West Indies. Popular among whom, though? It's 1692 after all. Who could have been there? Port Royal, Jamaica, a beautiful and heavily traveled tourist location today, was frequented by the most dubious of opportunists and pirates who were, quote, doing business in the Caribbean Sea. Yeah, doing business, that's rich. Come on now. In the 17th century, Port Royal was known throughout the entire New World as a veritable headquarters for piracy, smuggling, and debauchery. As I mentioned at the end of yesterday's episode, it was known far and wide as, quote, the most wicked and sinful city in the world and one of the lewdest in the Christian world. I just gotta ask, if it was that bad, how could it still be considered Christian? I'm just asking. Welcome to year 2 of this podcast. Right now, you're listening to the full version of today's story on your favorite podcast provider. But there's also the daily podcast video short. They're shot right here in my podcast recording studio, so you get that perspective. But oftentimes, they will include visuals from that day's event from when it happened in weather history. So after listening to the full story, go check out the podcast video short on television or online anytime at theweathernetwork.com/weather history. Now for a bit of geography to build out the details of this story's significance. Port Royal was on a small island off the coast of Jamaica in the harbor across from what is present-day Kingston. There was a population of roughly 6,500, and many of these people lived in residences that were precariously positioned, elevated up and over the water. Yippee! Oceanfront property. Very nice. Yeah, they thought so too in other hot oceanfront location destinations like California, Chile, and most of Indonesia. Earthquakes in the Caribbean Sea were not uncommon, but were usually rather small. 4 years prior to today's quake, there was another one that was strong enough to topple 3 homes. But on June 7th, things were not as fortunate. On this day in weather history, 3 powerful quakes struck Jamaica, and associated with it, a rather large tsunami hit soon after, and that was the death knell. It put half of the entire Port Royal under 40 feet of water, total inundation. There was a ship in the harbor, the HMS Swan. It was carried from the harbor and dropped on top of a building on the island. Now, if there is a silver lining anywhere in this tragedy, it was that this boat was actually now above the waterline, kind of like an ark, and turned out to be a refuge for survivors. Oh yeah, remember the many stories that I have told already on this podcast about land masses and the masses that live on that land that turn out to be not exactly what they thought it was? Yeah, the residents of Port Royal, a lot like the citizens of San Francisco in 1989, soon discovered that the ground they lived on was not exactly solid ground. The loosely packed soil liquefied, like in San Francisco in '89, and easily collapsed during the quake. In this, many buildings literally sank into the ground. In the aftermath, virtually every building in the city was uninhabitable, including 2 forts. Aftershocks continued for some time, so survivors just gave up on rebuilding Port Royal as the capital of the island, and instead, over on the mainland, the city of Kingston was built and remains to this day as the largest city in Jamaica. In total, about 3,000 people lost their lives on June 7th, 1692, at exactly 11:43 in the morning, this day in weather history. Tomorrow is June 8th. We know all too well the effects of a rapid snow melt and what it will have on water levels, and those effects are never good. In 1948, there was a heavy snowpack that met a sudden hot spell and then caused the Fraser River to rise dramatically. What happened as a result of this, I'm sure you can guess. But the full story is tomorrow on This Day in Weather History, with me, your host, Chris May.